Welcome everyone to part 4 of the bodywork restoration of my 1949 AC. I can't call this instalment ash frame restoration this time, as I'm going to be dealing with the body panelling, more specifically the alloy panels that will be permanently fixed to the ash frame. This panelling is made of duralumin, left over from World War II aircraft production. It's an alloy that was developed before World War I and is known as an age hardening alloy. That is, after heat treatment it slowly becomes harder and stronger over a period of hours, weeks and even months. When it is slightly work hardened in the course of making panels, its strength is comparable to mild steel, but only 1/3 of the weight. Annealing will reduce the strength as well as the hardness. Its proof stress is slightly less than steel's yield strength, which means the panels will dent more easily depending on how thick they are. AC used thicker gauge alloy for the wings. On the AC there are a few separate inner panels, and also the door surrounds are covered by numerous small panels. My first task was to strip off the original paint. I used Rustin's paint stripper. In fact, the cellulose paint softens very easily and you can scrape the semi-liquid top coat and undercoat off. The undercoat on my AC was grey. The original primer was red lead, which is a deep pink colour. This turned almost liquid easily, but it was reluctant to come off. I found that the best way was to soften it with paint stripper, then use kitchen paper to rub it off. The last traces took a bit of time to remove, and I discovered that POR 15 metal cleaner removes it fast. Take care when dealing with this lead-based paint. You'll notice that I did not remove it with abrasives, as you don't want to generate any paint dust. A more complex challenge was to deal with the cracks and other damage. Most of these occur when the wood frame rots and there's nothing to support the panel. The one area where there's an obvious design flaw is the bottom rear corners of the door openings. It cracks from the sharp corners. A more frustrating crack problem for AC owners is at the rear, where up to 4 cracks might appear at the welds. I suspect that this happens when the glue joints fail in the wood frame, so that any twisting along the car becomes concentrated at the corners of the boot lid. So what procedure is best for repairing? We're not dealing with stressed panels, and with the wood repaired, existing cracks might not get any worse. Back in the 1980s, an AC owner told me he repaired his by cutting out a small section of those rear strips around each crack and welding in a new piece. He reasoned that you cannot weld up a crack directly, which is true, because you can't clean the inside of a crack, although you could just file out a tiny bit of the cracks around. I didn't like his idea because it doubles the number of weak points, and also every weld creates what is known as a heat affected zone, or HAZ, in the metal around the welds. That is a zone of metal near the weld that has been weakened, typically up to an inch or 25mm from the weld. My late father said the normal procedure with such cracks is to drill a hole at the crack's end to stop it extending. I would rather have a barely visible crack than a hole in the body on these non-stressed parts. Aerospace repair methods I read about included epoxy glue repairs with glass fibre patches to reinforce them. That avoids creating those heat-affected zones. I then got interested in some brazing processes developed in the USA. I bought a kit called HTS 2000. I experimented with it on a sheet of pure aluminium and it worked very well. I then tried it on one of these panels that fit behind the front wings. Also on this panel for the doorstep. It did not work well. In fact, I ended up creating more damage. I contacted the HTS 2000 folk in both the UK and the USA. They seemed very keen to help. They had used it on aircraft alloy, but it might not have been the same type. Using the American alloy designations, the original version of duralumin is also known as alloy 2017. A newer alloy, 2024, appeared in the 1930s, but I don't know which type is on the AC. I did confirm that the panels contain copper, which is what distinguishes the 2000 series of alloys. Many thanks to my AC owning friend in Adelaide, Australia, for getting a sample tested. Interestingly, the technical data I have on alloys says that this type is not easy to weld, unlike slightly later alloys that don't involve copper. Evidently someone butt welded a lot of panels together on my AC. I abandoned plans to use brazing. Finances were too tight at the time to go and consult any local aircraft technicians, so I did my repairs with epoxy and glass fibre patches. This requires a bit of preparation, not only for cleanliness but also removing the oxide layer. Bare aluminium is covered by a transparent layer of oxide that is very tough. The aerospace industry have chemicals to remove and treat the surface prior to painting or gluing, but these chemicals are hazardous and expensive. When painting, it's more usual for car restorers to apply etch primer. You can remove the oxide with abrasives, but the oxide starts to reappear straight away. However, with repairs on a tiny area, I think it is viable to abrade the surface, clean it quickly and then apply a proxy adhesive suitable for this purpose. It is also advisable to degrease the surface before abrading. For the door corners, I reinforced the lower ends of the cracks, which are accessible with the car fully assembled. With hindsight, I should have reinforced the outside of this big crack to hold it while the body shell gets lifted back onto the car. The panels that cover the door steps had some additional damage. These door steps are handy to rest things on, such as hot drinks flasks when having picnics. I'm thinking back to childhood, as Mum used to make such use of this little feature. A drawback is that if any stone chips land on the doorsteps, they don't roll off. When you close the door, it punctures the alloy. Our family driveway used to be made up of stone chips. I painted these inner panels and also the exposed parts of the sills. I'd hoped to use stainless steel panel pins, but I could only find stainless for the larger of the two sizes required. For the mild steel pins, I dipped them in clear wax oil. I pilot drilled the pinholes and used a block of steel to help get the pins in flush without damaging anything. I applied silicone sealant under the edges of these panels. For some panels it was easier to apply clear wax oil under the edges. I also test fitted this quick release panel. I'd previously fitted new plywood inside with new Whitworth coach bolts inserted and repaired a hole someone had cut in the alloy. Then I annealed the bottom edge and folded it over the plywood. It originally did not fit snugly against the doorstep, so I reprofiled the lower edge and added a tiny extra piece of aluminium. Okay, that's the easy part done. Now to tackle the enormous body shell. I stripped paint from the edges ready for when I anneal those edges. That is to reduce the fire hazard within my small garage, as the paint gives a brief flash of flame as it burns under a blowtorch. There were a few dents and creases to straighten out. I annealed 2 of those. Annealing aluminium is tricky because the metal does not change colour, so there is a risk of melting it. An old technique I vaguely recalled was to apply soap to the metal and heat it until the soap turns black. I wondered if there was a more precise method and found all sorts of people supplying special heat-sensitive crayons. They were expensive. They also had to be applied to the back of the panel where I would not be able to see them. So I used soap, which needs to be a simple soap with nothing fancy added to it, and it worked easily using my trusty little butane torch. I was able to do some panel beating along the edge of the roof, which I had easy access to with no wood frame in the way. You might be wondering how this got damaged, and in fact it was the one and only mishap I had with the AC when I drove it back in the 80s. However, the resulting dispute was with a major corporation, so I'd better not discuss it here. As to the repairs, I've seen how professionals deal with aluminium panel beating with a range of dollies and hammers. It hardly seemed worth buying sets of tools for a one-off repair, so I used offcuts of plywood with various curves and hammered everything into shape. Unlike steel, aluminium doesn't spring back into shape. You have to work it as though you are almost starting from scratch. I dealt with the various cracks. I used a triangular needle file to create a V-slot into each crack to get a clean surface, and then carried out an epoxy repair with fiberglass patch. I made a second support frame to hold the rear of the body shell while I repaired the cracks at the rear. I found a small crack starting in this weld, which did not extend to either edge, which was visible on the outside, as seen here in close-up. I glued on a temporary patch to the outside to be filed flush later. I used the same technique to fix it in a repair piece of aluminium where the radio aerial was in the roof. You can see that I'd removed the light bulb when the body shell went into the garage back in 1991. Now I was ready for the final preparation for the shell to go back on. Having painted the wood frame, I did not want the edges of the panelling to scratch the paint off during refitting. Therefore, I wrapped parts of the frame in heavy-duty polythene sheets with clear wax oil underneath. I hoped this would make it easy to pull the sheets out once the shell was on. I also planned to use wax oil as a sealant all around the shell, as it would be very difficult to apply silicone sealant, which typically sets within 20 minutes. And so to the big day, 17th of August 2015. It was a Monday, the day after I attended a local classic car gathering. I think the sunshine must have got to me because it triggered one of my migraines by the Monday morning. Fortunately a mild migraine, but I did not want to postpone my plans as I'd arranged to get assistance from a local friend, Dave. Here he is pictured with his trusty spaniel, Lily. Sadly both Dave and Lily have since passed away. I spent a couple of hours in the morning doing final preps. I removed the doors, which are very heavy, and cleared the garage. I then went to my couch and fell asleep. I was awoken at 2 p.m. by Dave knocking at my door, wondering where I was. I got the car out and began work annealing the edges of the body shell. Why did I leave it this late? Since duralumin is an age-hardening alloy, I wondered if this applied to annealing it. I found two old articles from before World War II that described annealing. One said it doesn't age harden, and the other said it does. So I worked on the assumption that after annealing the metal, I will only have a few days to hammer it back over the frame before the risk of cracking increases. I did my best not to burn down the garage as I applied soap and heated until black along numerous edges. Halfway through, my butane torch ran out of gas and my spare canister wouldn't fit. The old torch was obsolete, so went out to the local DIY store and bought a new blowtorch. With the annealing done, I was feeling shattered, as my migraines always last 3 days. At this point, a third man arrived on his motorbike. It wasn't Orson Welles, but rather a nice gent who recognised Dave and stopped to chat. He was kind enough to stay and lend a hand. The AC needed to be turned around, and with the three of us, it was easy to complete a 13-point turn. The next stage was for me to spread clear wax oil along those parts of the frame that the panelling will rub against, partly as a water seal to the edges and partly to prevent squeaking where metal touches wood. This was when the day took on a surreal nature. It was a surreal character who arrived, the fourth man. He greeted Dave, who was a retired prison guard, and introduced himself as a former client or inmate. This fourth man's behaviour became rather worrying as his demeanour swung between different moods. At one stage he took off his belt and gave some kung fu demos and challenged the third man to a fight. He was not keen on the idea. As his mood improved, he asked for a lift home on the motorbike. Third man was not keen on that either. We couldn't seem to get rid of this odd character, and Dave whispered to me that we should abandon the day's plans. I told him we've gone past the point of no return, we are doing it today. After 45 minutes, the fourth man finally departed. Now to the big moment. Make or break for my whole restoration. Sadly there are no photos of this historic moment. As you can surmise, I was rather too preoccupied to think about recording this event. My assistants held up the front of the body shell while I removed the temporary frame supporting it. Dave and I wore thick gloves for protection, although the edges of the panelling were not all that sharp. A steel shell would have been much worse. I made my next mistake when I failed to ask someone to help hold my side. As I mentioned, I was feeling extremely tired, but I also had memories of easily lifting it with only one helper way back in 1991. Both my assistants were holding the left-hand side, and I held the right-hand edge. We carried it out of the garage and then had to lift it high over the roof on the wood frame. That's when I almost collapsed. It was one of those moments when a reserve of superhuman strength was called upon, much like when you are dangling from a ledge and need to save yourself. That only happens infrequently. We managed not to damage the sills and had the shell down, but it had not gone on properly. I checked at the back, and the bottom edge was resting on top of the wooden cross member and had split the big crack repair I'd made. We lifted the back and got it almost in place, but the rear window surrounds were reluctant to go in. It was showing that it was never designed to be fitted as a complete shell. Two areas that I knew would be awkward were the rear corners of the side windows. As these edges cannot be unfolded, we had to pull out the sides enough to get past the frame. After some persuasion, it popped in. Still not exact, but close enough to be able to tie the sills safely to the frame to prevent damage when moving the car. That was enough to complete the day's work, and I collapsed in a heap on the ground, but somehow feeling really good. In the evening, I rolled the car back into the garage. In one of those rare moments, I felt emotional as I realised I finally had my AC back after 24 years. Next began an intensive period of work over the following 19 days. Firstly, the sheets of heavy-duty polythene wrapped around parts of the wood frame came out nice and easily. The front end of the shell was not going fully down because the roof needed to move a millimetre or two forwards. A useful reference was the row of nail holes for the guttering. I did some panel beating along the right-hand side of the shell using the wood frame to get everything straight, and this eventually allowed the shell to move 0.5 of a millimetre forwards. That was nearly 5 hours' work. My efforts were encouraged by all the nice people stopping to admire the car. I think the paint I'd applied to the frame was causing problems in regions that were very tight fit. I sanded part of the rear shelf assembly where the shell was touching it, just below and to the right of the rear windows. I also sanded the wood along the right-hand cant rail. This helped, and the front of the shell dropped down almost into place. Finally, I folded over the bottom edges of the rear window opening, which lifted the rear end slightly. I then hammered nails into the gutter nail holes temporarily, and these gradually forced the shell forwards. That did the trick, and the front finally dropped into place with the panel pin holes lining up. When I made the new wooden sill rail assemblies, it was hard to measure the required lateral position, so I made them slightly oversized. In the event, I did have to plane them down slightly and repaint them for a perfect fit under the panelling. I'd had a visit to the Morgan car factory back in 2013 and paid close attention to the process of fitting panels. You have to clamp the panels to make sure that they only bend at the fold line without distorting any other areas. On the left-hand A-pillar, I had adjusted the wooden pillar for a better door closure, which meant bending the panel edge in a slightly different place from the original fold line. This left a small gap at the bottom, which I later filled with an additional piece of aluminium. I fitted a limited number of panel pins for now, before test fitting the door. Note that panel pins must go in at an angle so that they don't split off the edges of the timber. I also fitted the front wing. The gaps around the door looked pretty good. It was touching at the bottom, but this was an issue with mounting the hinges. They had dropped slightly, and I later glued strips of thin plywood into the hinge recesses to raise the doors up. I then did the same on the right-hand side, and much to my surprise the door fitted almost perfectly. Then a quick test fit of the boot lid and spare wheel door to check that the panels are flush all along the curves. It wasn't perfect at first, but careful fitting of the panel pins adjusted the curve of the main shell. Then I hammered over the panel edges around the rear windows. I was worried about creases showing, as when I previously unfolded the edges, it was inevitable that there would be creases along a curved edge. I need not have worried, since hammering against the wood frame works well on aluminium because it does not tend to spring back much. Then the same for the side window surrounds. Test fitted the side windows. Now to hammer over the wheel arch edges and then test fit the wings. The join will be hidden by PVC wing piping for the final installation. Everything is fitting well. Then the laborious task of installing hundreds of panel pins. I briefly removed all the wings for access to the panel pins. Then I had to repair the guttering. As they were originally nailed on, I'd been forced to resort to prising them off back in 1991, as there is no access for tools to pull the nails out. I had to carefully straighten out these gutters, which are made from extruded aluminium, match them to the body curves, and then fitted stainless steel wood screws. I also test fitted the trafficators to make sure that they can line up with the slots. The main part of the bodywork was now finished, after 2,500 hours of work over a 6-year period. You deserve a medal for making it this far into the video. The ash frame challenges were not over yet. Those very large doors are ash framed, and the driver's door presented some challenges I had not anticipated. You'll have to wait until the next video for that story. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.